Good morning and welcome to all of you who are here for our webinar on vaccinations, specifically titled, Is It Moral to Take the COVID-19 Vaccination? I'm Tom Sheehan, the director of ITEST, and for all of those of you who are newcomers, we should tell you that ITEST stands for Institute for Theological Encounter with Science and Technology. Our organization has been active at the interface between religious faith and science for over 50 years. We've conducted conferences, webinars, seminars, and workshops, other activities that address issues, sometimes controversial issues, where science bears upon some religious topic. The mission of ITEST is as follows: to influence decisions and policy in human communities. ITEST fosters and disseminates the position that science and faith in God are complementary paths to human fulfillment. That notion of complementary paths is a cornerstone of ITEST's purpose. And we realize that it's quite at odds with the conventional view of science versus faith or science against faith that is often promulgated in the public square. Generally, our conferences and webinars strive to bring out the unity between faith and science that is sometimes hidden. In any individual webinar, the purpose is not to provide some right answer, but instead to leave our attendees in a better informed position to make their own decisions. ITEST physical headquarters are at the Cardinal Regali Center in St. Louis. That's the Archdiocesan Central Office Building. However, today we are coming to you via Zoom from locations in several different states and several different time zones. To begin with today's program, I'm going to call upon Father Tom Davis to offer an opening prayer, after which Father Davis will provide some background information about vaccines. Father Davis.
Thank you. Good morning. I'm Father Tom Davis. I'm a priest of the Melkite Greek Catholic Church, one of the Eastern Rite Catholic churches privileged to have communion with the Pope of Rome. I'm the pastor of St. Anne Melkite Catholic Church in Danbury, Connecticut, and I am also the president of the Liberty Institute for Faith and Ethics. The acronym is LIFE. It's a multidisciplinary organization studying issues of bioethics and religious liberty, and it can be accessed at libertyforlife.org. That's liberty, the number 4, life.org. I'm also the faculty chair of the graduate concentration in bioethics at Holy Apostles College and Seminary in Cromwell, Connecticut. I'm delighted to be with you all today, and I have been asked to offer an opening prayer and provide some brief context for what promises to be an engaging and informative discussion. But before I invoke the divine blessing on our fellowship this morning, I think it best to highlight the enormity of the issues to be discussed. Abortion is a grave evil. It is a crime. In 2004, then Cardinal Ratzinger, as prefect of the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, wrote a confidential memorandum, since publicized, to then Cardinal McCarrick. This is a well-known memorandum. In it, he wrote, "A Catholic, and I might add anyone, would be guilty of formal cooperation in evil if he were to deliberately vote for a candidate precisely because of the candidate's permissive stand on abortion and/or euthanasia. When a Catholic does not share a candidate's stand in favor of abortion and/or euthanasia, but votes for that candidate for other reasons, it is considered remote material cooperation, which can be permitted in the presence of proportionate reasons." Unpacking those concepts introduced by Cardinal Ratzinger in that famous memorandum, albeit in a very different context, is why we gather today. The question of how human persons engage in voluntary activity that associates them in some way with evil actions undertaken by others has puzzled almost every thinking person from time immemorial. What is formal cooperation juxtaposed to material cooperation? Catholic moral reflection has a well-settled framework within which moral responsibility for cooperating with the evil acts done by others is assessed. But that does not necessarily make the application of those principles to specific circumstances easy. The tradition, as Cardinal Ratzinger described, divides cooperation into two broad categories called formal and material. And critically, within the latter, distinguishes immediate material cooperation from mediate material cooperation. And the latter is then further divided between what is termed proximate as opposed to remote immediate cooperation, the latter of which Cardinal Ratzinger noted can be permitted in the presence of proportionate reasons. Well, that's quite a thicket and a difficult one at times. It is an essential thicket to engage. Many questions swirl around the development of the COVID-19 vaccines and many other vaccines. Most of the vaccines have been developed from three principal human fetal cell lines known as WI38, MRC5, and HEK293. The first two were known to be derived from elective abortions in the early 1960s, and the last one, HEK293, is a bit more ambiguous. It was developed from fetal kidney cells of unknown gestational age in 1973 by Professor Frank Graham. It may have been from an elective abortion and until recently was widely assumed to be so, although we should exercise some caution since one of our most well-known moral theologians and eminent biologists, Father Reverend Nicodore Ostrayko from Providence College, has recently disclosed in his email exchanges with Professor Graham that Dr. Graham advised that the exact origin of HEK239 or 293 is unclear and may have been the product of a spontaneous abortion or a miscarriage. That may or may not be significant for today's discussion, but it is worth noting that HEK293 was used by Moderna and Pfizer in the testing of their vaccine, although not in the actual production of the vaccine itself. Father Ostrayko's article revealing that information is available at thepublicdiscourse.com in his article, Moral Guidance on Using COVID-19 Vaccines Developed from Human Fetal Cells. Well, thank you all for your interest in this very, very important subject. Let us pray. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit, one God. Lord God, bless our fellowship, purify our hearts, and grace those presenting this day with the light of your wisdom. Grant the petitions of countless men and women troubled by the pandemic that has descended on our world. Preserve those who have escaped its grasp. Heal those taunted by its misery, O physician of our souls and bodies. Encourage the downhearted and the lonely, those isolated by quarantines, those fearful of what was once the normal socialization of humanity. Bless the good works of public authorities and the diligent efforts of those who have developed the intellectual gifts that you have granted to find treatments and methods to cure or mitigate the scourge we face. Protect the frontline healthcare providers, whose fortitude has earned them the respect of your creation. Open our minds to the learning and light we receive in our present encounter, and may your magnificent and noble name, Father, only begotten Son, and all holy, good, and life-giving Spirit, be praised, glorified, and exalted, now and always and forever and ever. Amen.
Amen. Okay, thank you very much, Father Davis. To begin our program, first, I have a couple of mechanical items to call your attention to. At the bottom of your screen, there's a little icon labeled Q&A. That is where we invite you to submit any questions that may occur to you as we proceed along. After our two major presentations, there will be a question and answer session. Sheila Roth of ITEST, located at our St. Louis headquarters, We'll collect questions submitted via the Q&A tab, and we'll select certain questions to be directed to each speaker. We're anticipating a lively exchange of ideas today. I also point out the distinctly different chat icon at the bottom of the screen. That is not for questions. It's a kind of side conference room where individuals can send messages to each other. Please understand that if you're in the chat room, that won't be public or part of the questions. So now we're ready to begin. Our first speaker today is Dr. Moschella. Melissa is Associate Professor at the Catholic University of America and a visiting scholar at the Heritage Foundation, B.K. Simon Center for American Studies. Her research and teaching focus is on natural law, bioethics, and the moral and political status of the family. She is the author of numerous articles published in scholarly journals and popular media outlets. She graduated from Harvard College, received a licentiate in philosophy from the Pontifical University of the Holy Cross, and received her PhD in political philosophy from Princeton University. Melissa was married last October, and she and her husband now live in Hyattsville, Maryland. Melissa, go ahead.
Thank you. Let me just share my screen here so that I can introduce the PowerPoint. Great. So thank you to ITEST for putting together this event, which I think is going to be a really fruitful dialogue on what is indeed a very, very important issue. And I'm very grateful to have the opportunity to present my own perspective on this topic. The argument that I'm going to make is that it is, in fact, morally right to take the COVID vaccine, and I should say when I speak of COVID vaccine, I mean shorthand for any of the available COVID vaccines. Of course, there are more than one. So reiterating briefly what's already been said as just a kind of background to the controversy, we see that the reason why some people worry about the ethics of receiving some of the COVID vaccines is that all of the available vaccines used cell lines derived from aborted fetal tissue in either the development, production, and or testing of the vaccines. The cell lines in question with regard to the COVID vaccines are HEK293, which was derived from the kidney tissue of a fetus thought to be aborted electively in 1972, though we're not entirely sure about that. And the other is HER-C6, which was derived from the retina tissue of a fetus aborted in 1985, and we are certain that that was in fact an elective abortion. And we find that the Moderna and Pfizer vaccines, the ones currently available in our country, these vaccines only used HEK293 for confirmatory lab tests, did not use it for development or production of the vaccine. The AstraZeneca vaccine used HEK293 in all aspects of making the vaccine, development, production, and testing. And then the Johnson & Johnson vaccine, which is also likely to be approved quite soon, used HER-C6 in development, production, and testing. So that's just a kind of lay of the land in terms of where we stand with the various vaccines and the cell lines of illicit origin that were used in some form to help produce those vaccines. Now, some crucial facts to keep in mind before we get into the moral analysis. First, it's crucial to recognize that HEK293 and HER-C6 are what scientists often refer to as immortal cell lines. That means that they reproduce indefinitely. And so that means that using them does not create demand for new fetal tissue or new cell lines. Right? It's not something that the more you use of it, it kind of gets used up and then you need to replace it. That's the idea of the cell line being immortal. They reproduce indefinitely, so using more of it does not create demand for more of it or demand for a replacement. And this makes the use of historic cell lines like HEK293 or PER-C6 crucially different from the direct use of aborted fetal tissue or human embryos in research. When research uses direct aborted fetal tissue or human embryos, those do not reproduce indefinitely. And so that kind of research is going to create an ongoing demand for new tissue or new embryos to engage in the research. And another thing to keep in mind is that scientists generally prefer to use well-known established cell lines rather than new ones. So when scientists use an established cell line like HEK293, in a way this actually reduces the demand for new ones. Right? Scientists want to use cell lines whose properties they know well because it has been frequently used by other scientists before. They want to use cell lines that other scientists know well, cell lines that enable replication of their experiments for verification, more likely to pass peer review, and so on and so forth, right? So the fact that we have great knowledge of these established cell lines actually means that the more you use them, the less likely that there will be demand for new cell lines to be produced, which is again an important fact that will be relevant when considering the morality of using products derived from these cell lines. HEK293 in particular is one of the most commonly used cell lines in basic science research. So if you look at sort of PubMed citations or sort of large database of scientific research, HEK293 accounts for about 85% of those citations. In terms of basic science research, HEK293 is second only to the HeLa cell line, which was derived from the cancerous uterus of Henrietta Lacks. And the HeLa cell line, I should note, is also controversial ethically because those cells were taken from her without her knowledge or consent and made into an immortal cell line without her knowledge or consent. So that's just an aside, is that the two most commonly used cell lines in basic science research both have ethical issues. Obviously, the connection to abortion makes HEK293 even more problematic, but the HeLa cell line, the most commonly used one, also has ethical problems. And one of the reasons why it's important to note how pervasive the use of this cell line is that we need to realize that it is nearly impossible to do research without at least using products made from HEK293. So one could avoid the direct use of HEK293 in research, but if you really wanted to do research and avoid any connection to HEK293, it would be extremely difficult, if not impossible, to do it because HEK293 is also used to make some of the most commonly used molecular reagents and other research products. And often researchers don't even know what went into the making of those molecular reagents and research projects. So even figuring out whether the research products that you're using involve a cell line like HEK293 is extremely difficult. And again, avoiding any connection to it is nearly impossible because of the ubiquity of the cell line itself and the even greater ubiquity of products made with the cell line. So now we need to clarify, why was it wrong to create these cell lines in the first place? It seems obvious in some ways because of the connection to abortion, but I think it's important to be precise about what exactly was the wrong in creating the cell lines. So there are several things that constitute the moral wrongness of creating the cell lines. The first is that the researchers may have cooperated with abortion providers in order to procure the tissue. Now with HEK293, what we know about the origin of that indicates that this seems unlikely, right? Because the the scientist who developed the cell line didn't even know whether or not the tissue came from an elective abortion or a spontaneous miscarriage. So it's fairly clear that in that case, the scientists creating the cell line was not actively cooperating with abortion providers in order to arrange for the procurement of the tissue. If a scientist were, however, actively cooperating with abortion providers to arrange for procurement of the tissue, that would likely be formal cooperation in evil on the part of the researcher and would clearly be inherently immoral for that reason. It was also wrong to create the cell lines, even if there was no cooperation on the part of the researcher, because the prospect of using the tissue for research could be used by the abortion provider or the mother to assuage their consciences or rationalize their action after the fact, right? They might say, well, even if I'm slightly concerned about this or have some moral qualms, at least good comes out of this because, maybe cures or scientific advancement can result from this unfortunate decision. So that's a concern. And then lastly, the one thing that is certain in any of these cases is that proper consent was lacking. So while in some cases, the mother did give consent to have the aborted fetal tissue then used for research, clearly the woman who consents to and seeks the killing of the child in her womb is not in the proper place, morally speaking, to provide consent on behalf of the fetus who died as a result of her choice to abort. So whether or not official consent was present, proper consent from somebody who actually had the ethical or moral standing to give consent on behalf of the fetus was clearly lacking in this case. And I bring this out because I think it's important to note that there's nothing inherently wrong with using fetal tissue for research, just as there's nothing inherently wrong with using any other human tissue for research. The problem here is that the tissue was made available because of the murder of that child in the womb, and then that there was not proper consent. Somebody who had actually the interests of the child in mind was not able to give consent for that research, and that the research then indicates a lack of recognition of the humanity and dignity of the fetus that was killed, and the use of their remains does not, again, reflect a respect for their humanity and dignity. But one thing that is important to remember here as well is that the decision to abort has nothing to do with the prospect of using the tissue for research. I've certainly never heard of a case in which a woman's motivation for abortion was that she wanted to have the fetal tissue available for research. Clearly, the decision to abort is made for completely independent reasons, and then perhaps prior to the abortion, the woman may be asked, well, do we have your permission to use this tissue for research? Should that be an option? And she may say yes or no, but clearly that's a kind of independent thing that's tangential to the actual decision to abort. And again, that's important to keep in mind because it helps us to see how remote we are from the evil that we're really worried about, which is actually the evil of abortion. So now we can consider the framework that was already outlined for us, which is the framework of cooperation with evil. And this framework is the one that is typically used and is used by the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith and the USCCB and their statements on ethical considerations regarding the COVID vaccines. As we'll see, I actually am skeptical that this is the best framework to use here, but because it is commonly used in connection with this question, I think it's important to just go through it. So first, what does it mean to cooperate with evil? Well, cooperation with evil means contributing to somebody else's evil action. And there are several forms of cooperation. There's formal cooperation, which would be contributing to the evil while sharing the evil intention. An example of that would be, for instance, donating to Planned Parenthood with the goal of facilitating abortions, of making access to abortion easier. Formal cooperation is obviously always morally wrong, because to directly intend evil is always morally wrong, and in formal cooperation, you are directly intending an evil. Material cooperation involves contributing to the evil without sharing the evil intention. We've already heard some of the subsets of this. I'm not going to go into the nuts and bolts because I actually don't think it's relevant here, but one example of material cooperation would be investing in a company that donates to Planned Parenthood without thereby intending to facilitate abortions, or working in a hospital in which abortions are performed. And then the different levels of cooperation that had been discussed before, whether the material cooperation is immediate or more distant, that would vary, depend on, for instance, one's position at the hospital. Clearly, if one were a doctor or a nurse assisting doctors in performing abortions, that would be immediate material cooperation and would not be morally permissible. But more distant work in the hospital, perhaps even caring for women post-abortions or those who come in with complications after abortions, would be more remote and would not necessarily be morally impermissible. In general, the moral assessment of material cooperations depends on several things. First, how direct is my contribution to the evil? Second, is there a proportionate reason? Is there a serious enough reason? Is the good that I am bringing about by my actions, such as working in a hospital, serving patients, providing Christian witness within that setting, and so on, is that a proportionate reason to indirectly be contributing to the profits of a hospital that performs abortions, for instance? And then lastly, is that cooperation likely to cause scandal? Is it likely to make other people think that I am actually sharing in the evil intention, or that I fail to recognize the grave wrongness of the evil to which I am indirectly contributing? And is it possible to avoid that scandal or mitigate that scandal by some contrary action that makes it clear that I am opposed to the evil in question? So those are, again, a kind of rough sketch of the moral considerations regarding cooperation with evil. But now I put this with a question mark, because I actually don't think that, strictly speaking, taking the COVID vaccines involves cooperation with evil. Why do I say that? Well, the evil, which is the cooperation with abortion and the use of aborted fetal tissue without proper consent, happened in the past. And nothing we do today can change what happened. And so we are not contributing to an evil action, because it's impossible to contribute to an evil that happened in the past and is completed. Secondly, taking the vaccines does not create demand for more aborted fetal tissue. So it also does not constitute cooperation with the ongoing evil of using aborted fetal tissue for research. So therefore, I think that actually cooperation with evil, even though often this discussion is couched in terms of passive cooperation with evil, it's a kind of awkward use that actually obscures what I think are some of the more relevant moral considerations. So I think a better framework, one that was introduced by a moral theologian, Kathleen Caveney, in a very important theological studies article many years ago, and has since then been picked up by many moral theologians, is the framework of appropriation. So appropriation of the fruits of evil means that we are benefiting from a past evil. And clearly taking the vaccine does involve appropriation, because it involves benefiting from prior evil actions. The ethical concerns with appropriation mirror some of the ethical concerns with cooperation, but I think more clearly get at the distinctive element of connection with the evil, which is benefiting from past evil versus contributing to present or future evil. So the first ethical concern, and the one that mirrors formal cooperation, is ratification of the past evil, which means approving of the past evil from which you are benefiting. And this, like formal cooperation with evil, is always wrong because you share in the evil intention. The second set of ethical concerns with appropriation regard concerns with corruption of character. That benefiting from a past evil may desensitize you to that evil or lessen the firmness of your moral opposition to it, lessen even your willingness to fight against it, precisely because you are benefiting from it. And so a proportionate reason is required to accept these risks of corruption of character that are present anytime we benefit from a past evil. And then lastly, as with cooperation, there's a concern with scandal. Will my appropriation be reasonably interpreted as implying ratification, as implying approval of the past evil, or failure to recognize the gravity of the past evil? So let's apply this framework to the issue at hand. Does taking the COVID vaccines involve ratification? Does it necessarily involve ratification of the past evil? I think clearly the answer is no, that one can take the vaccine without approving of how the cell lines used to make the vaccine were derived. What about the risks to moral character of benefiting from the past evil? Seems to me that the risks are low. The vaccines are very far removed from the original evil, and the original evil, which is, as I noted before, the possible cooperation with abortion of the researchers that initially made the cell line, and the lack of proper consent in obtaining the tissues to create the cell lines, is itself already one or more steps removed from the abortion itself. However, it is still important to make the effort not to be desensitized to the use of aborted fetal tissue in research and to promote ethical alternatives. So a real effort needs to be made to counteract even the relatively low risks to corruption of character that benefiting from these past evils involves. And then there's the question of, is there a proportionate reason to accept these risks to moral character? And it seems, again, clear that the answer to that is yes. Vaccination is not just a private benefit, but is a duty for the common good. It's crucial to achieving herd immunity, limiting illness and death, restoring social and economic life, and so on. What about scandal? It seems to me that scandal, given everything that I've just said, that it is not reasonable for someone to be scandalized by pro-lifers taking the vaccine, for the reasons mentioned above, that it's unreasonable to think that taking the vaccine implies approval of how the cell lines used to make the vaccine were derived, or implies any desensitization to the evil of abortion. The real risk of scandal, it seems to me, is a kind of counter-scandal that could result from unreasonable refusal of pro-lifers to be vaccinated, that may in fact undermine the credibility of the pro-life movement or create a kind of backlash against the pro-life movement. So let's just put the issue in perspective here with some analogous cases. So think, for instance, about medical knowledge and treatments. If we looked into the origin of the medical knowledge that we routinely benefit from, or the medical treatments that we routinely benefit from, we'll find that there were very, very serious immoral origins to much of this knowledge and many of these treatments, right? Many medical treatments that we have, much of the medical knowledge that we have is originally derived from very seriously unethical experiments, including Nazi experiments on those in concentration camps. So the anti-malarial drug chloroquine, for example, was developed by Nazi experimentation. The drug retin A, which is used for dermatological purposes, among other things, was developed with unethical experiments on Black prisoners. Knowledge of human anatomy that we have came from, gruesomely conducted experiments done by the Nazis. We could never get that knowledge in an ethical way, yet that knowledge is what is used to train our medical students today. Or we can think about land. Much of the land that we now use was unjustly taken from Native Americans or taken in unjust wars. The railroads, most of the railroads in the United States South were built by slaves. So does using those railroads imply that we approve of the evil of slavery? No, of course not. Does using the land that was unjustly taken from Native Americans imply that we approve of the way in which we got that land? Obviously not. Perhaps one of the most close analogies that we could think of would be the analogy of receiving an organ transplant from a murder victim. So presume, a case in which somebody was murdered, but is an organ donor, and their organs are then used for transplantation. Clearly, there was a very close connection to the evil, right? That organ would not be available for transplantation if the person had not been murdered. Yet there is nothing wrong with using an organ for transplant from a murder victim as long as there is proper consent. And obviously, as long as this doesn't sort of incentivize murder by creating a market for organs. Another way to put the issue in perspective is to compare the issue of taking the vaccine to daily instances of cooperation with evil that probably most of us engage in. So buying products made with slave labor in many parts of the world, products like rice, coffee, roses, chocolate, clothing, carpets, and so on are made with forced labor, often, not legally slavery, but effective slave conditions, and many of us have these products in our homes. Buying products from companies that donate to Planned Parenthood. There are hundreds of such companies, everything from Energizer batteries to Nike shoes to banking with Bank of America or Chase. Indirectly will cooperate with the work of Planned Parenthood. Investing in any large index fund. All of these funds have significant shares in companies that donate to Planned Parenthood or conduct research on human embryos or do other things that are serious affronts to the dignity of human life. Paying taxes. Of course, many of our taxes go to things that are gravely immoral. But it seems to me that any of these things could be, in fact, morally permissible. Probably most of them are morally permissible, that there seem to be proportionate reasons, at least for most of them. But that these are true cooperation with evil, whereas taking the vaccine, I think, is not. And they're more direct in terms of their promotion of abortion than taking the vaccine. So, to conclude, first, a reminder of the crucial facts that the connection between the COVID vaccines and abortion is extremely limited, and that taking the vaccine does not perpetuate the evil of abortion or even the lesser evil of using aborted fetal tissue for research. Secondly, the evaluation of the moral dangers in light of the facts. Cooperation, taking the vaccine involves no cooperation with evil, and even if it did, that cooperation would be extremely remote, more remote than many other common actions. And I believe that pro-lifers can make much better use of their limited resources on other fronts. Then with regard to appropriation, we've seen that taking the vaccine does not imply ratification. It doesn't imply approval of abortion, nor does it imply a significant risk of desensitization to the grave evil of abortion. So the overall moral evaluation, given all of these considerations, first, that herd immunity requires widespread vaccination and is crucial for the common good. Second, that because vaccination is not inherently evil, it doesn't involve any formal cooperation or ratification, doesn't involve any share in any of the evil intentions at the origins of these cell lines. It all comes down to considerations of proportionality. The reasons not to take the vaccine, I have argued, are quite weak. and the reasons to take it are clearly very strong. Therefore, I believe that taking the vaccine is the right thing to do. So thank you for listening, and I look forward to your questions.
Okay, thank you very much, Melissa. That was a fine presentation. Now, for our second presentation today, we have Dr. Stacy Trasancos. Stacy is the Executive Director of Bishop Joseph Strickland's St. Philip Institute of Catechesis and Evangelization in Tyler, Texas. And she's the Chief Research Officer of Children of God for Life. Stacy is the author of the book Particles of Faith, a Catholic Guide to Navigating Science. And she has written many articles in Catholic publications. She holds a PhD in chemistry from Penn State and graduated with an MA in doctoral dogmatic theology from Holy Apostles College and Seminary. Stacy is a mother of 7 and grandmother of 6. She and her husband Jose live with their family in Hideaway, Texas. Stacy, it's all yours.
Thank you, Tom. And thank you, Dr. Moschella, for that excellent talk. I am so happy that we're both here today talking about this important issue. I'm honored to share the stage with you, seriously. Okay, let's begin. Okay, so I want to add to the discussion that was already going on. There are some points that I disagree with, and I think it's important that we air those and talk about them and hash them out. Because what we're doing here, in my mind anyway, is a moral calculus. We're all trying to figure out what the right thing is to do. So I'm not going to tell you that it's moral for you to take the vaccine. I think that what's more correct about what the church says is that we all have to have an informed consent, an informed decision, prudential judgment. We have to make our own choice based on our own set of circumstances. And so what I'm trying to do is add more to the consideration. I know there's already a lot to consider, but I think there is more to the story than what we've already heard. So I'm adding to this. I know you've heard this, 3 times now, but I'm going to go through it very quickly. What is remote licit cooperation in evil? Because that is the question people who are new to this issue ask a lot. What does that mean? Because it doesn't sound good. But like Dr. Moschella was saying, it's kind of hard not to cooperate in evil if you live in society. So what we're talking about with the distinctions, and these are not buckets where every situation fits neatly into one or another. It's really kind of a gamut. Obviously, formal cooperation in evil is wrong. There's also material cooperation in evil, where you're not conducting the evil act, but you're using the material from it. You're still cooperating. But this can get broken down into more distinctions. There's mediate, which is most direct, and it is wrong in these cases we're talking about because you're still intending for the abortion to occur. There's immediate, which is less direct. It's getting towards what we're talking about with the parents. Mediate is always proximate. This all comes right from the 2005 Pontifical Academy for Life instructions on cell lines in vaccines. There's immediate material cooperation that can be proximate or remote. So it's not as clear how proximate immediate material cooperation is always wrong. And there may be cases where it's not, because we're talking again in a gamut. But what we're talking about with parents and, well, parents with children with childhood vaccines, which has been the issue since decades ago, and what most people involved in this discussion are familiar with, is not just parents now, it's all of us. We're trying to figure out if we can take this vaccine in good conscience. And so our remote, immediate material cooperation can have other distinctions, passive or active. Passive meaning not doing anything, active meaning doing something. And regardless of where we come out, we all have a grave responsibility, which I want to talk about in just a minute. That's part of the moral calculus. Formal cooperation would be the abortion, and it might be the researcher, like Dr. Moschella was saying. It might be the researcher who says, I need a fetus that is 23 weeks old, and I need it an hour after the abortion. So wait till you've got the woman who's going to do that. Maybe even tell her to wait to have the abortion another couple of weeks because we need this sample. That would be formal cooperation as well. You have more distance when you get to research and development. Maybe there's a researcher in a lab who is ordering fetal tissues from the fetal bank on campus, like they do at the University of Pittsburgh. And he says, I need fresh fetal hearts. Can you get me some? That's still immediate. It's proximate. It's still wrong. There's more remoteness when you get to development. Maybe you have people in the science lab who are using the fetal cell lines and they don't really know about the origin of it, but they have a responsibility to know. In Dignitas Personae, this is dealt with. And because it's abortion, those workers also have a duty to avoid scandal, to say, no, I'm not going to use these materials. So it's wrong to use the fetal cell lines. Of course, not everybody that uses them in the lab knows that, but it's still wrong nonetheless. And the church is very clear on that in Dignitas Personae. Then you have manufacturing and marketing. You have the people that run the manufacturing facility where the vaccines might be grown in the fetal cell lines. You have the people that market them. That's more remote. And then you have doctors who prescribe them or make them available in the hospital. They could speak up to the hospital. They are closer to the evil than the parents or the patients. And then you have out here in this remote situation, I call it being backed into a corner, because as a mother with babies back in 2003, 2005, sitting in a doctor's office saying, I object to this vaccine. I'm doing what the church asked me to do. And I'm standing up and I'm saying, I object to this vaccine grown in a fetal cell line. And I sat there with tears running down my face, but I want to protect my child. And so I'm backed into a corner and I said, I'll take the vaccine. My children are all vaccinated with vaccines grown in fetal cell lines, knowingly, because I chose to protect them and I chose to protect our community, but I did not like it. And when COVID-19 came along, I honestly expected the bioethicists and the philosophers and the moral theologians and the church and the priests and the bishops to get behind all of us parents who have been trying to follow what the church says all these decades and say, we are not going to take this vaccine if you use a fetal cell line. Of course, now everybody's talking about it. This is good. And we're learning much more to it. I've learned things from talking to Dr. Moschella and other people about the ubiquitousness of HEK 293, and they have a point when they say you're being hypocrites not to take the vaccine, but to use all of these other things. So I think we need to have this conversation. Going back to what the Pontifical Academy for Life told us parents back in 2005, it said if you get the vaccine because you judge that there's a grave reason to do so, you still have a responsibility to use alternatives when you can and to make a conscientious objection. Now, decades later, I'm looking back and my voice here is saying it doesn't work to sit in a doctor's office and say, I'm okay with benefiting from abortion, but I want you to stop doing that, because the manufacturers, the scientists, the pharmaceutical companies, the government, all they hear is, I'm going to get the vaccine. And so it does make a difference in what we do going forward. And I have seen it. Saying you're going to accept the fetal cell line, it's not just a slice in time and you're all done. There, I made my decision. It's not going to have any bearing on what the industry does going forward. It's not going to cause any more aborted children to be used in research. I absolutely disagree with that. It is not a fact that that doesn't happen. It's an arguable point, but it's not a fact. The church also said, as regards the vaccines without an alternative, there is a need to contest so that others may be prepared. And it must be reaffirmed that the lawfulness of using these vaccines in the meantime, so they were only supposed to be temporary, in order to avoid a serious risk for our children, or for the population of a whole. So the church was affirming that it is morally permissible, but they're not saying it's morally fine. They're saying if you need to, go ahead, but you're not done here, Catholics. You still have an obligation. And the lawfulness of using these vaccines should not be misinterpreted as declaration of the lawfulness of their production. We can't just say we have no qualms about using HEK 293 or any other fetal cell line. We send a message when we say that we're willing to not only benefit from it, but excuse it. And this cooperation occurs in, and I think a lot of people right now with COVID-19 feel this, a moral coercion of the conscience. You're backed into that corner. Since my husband and I started doing the work with Children of God for Life, which was founded by the woman who got this Pontifical Academy for Life instructions from the Vatican back then, Debbie Vintage, we are on the phone every day with people calling us so upset. Why didn't my priest tell me about these fetal cell lines? Why didn't the church do something? How come this has been going on for so long? And they're not comforted when you tell them that HEK 293 or other fetal cell lines are ubiquitous in our pharmaceuticals. They're mad. They're madder. And they say, well, then how come nobody ever did anything? What can I do? So people are worked up about this. They are heartbroken. And I think we should be heartbroken. I don't think we should ever, I would say that we have become complacent, or it wouldn't be that HEK 293 is the second most popular fetal cell line used ubiquitously. So scandal is fittingly described as something done less rightly, so as to compromise both whatever is sinful in itself and all that has the appearance of impropriety or evil. This comes from St. Thomas Aquinas, and he quotes scripture there. And we know what this is, but it's like if you go in the idol's temple and you're having dinner with the idol, you have to think maybe your intention is not evil. Maybe if we benefit from medical research done with abortion, our intention is not evil to benefit, but we still have to consider what that does to other people who are watching us. If we now, as the church said, it's fine, there's no qualm about using these fetal cell lines in our vaccines because we really need them, it absolutely did send a message to the pharmaceutical industry that Catholics are not going to be a problem when it comes to doing this. I'm speaking as if I were sitting on the other side of the table, like Aquinas does. I'm understanding the objections, and I worked for DuPont, so I've worked in an R&D facility that scales products up to the manufacturing, and I am pretty confident that all they heard was we're willing to benefit from these fetal tissue research, aborted fetal cell lines. We're willing to benefit from it. That's all they need to know. We can say stop doing that all we want. It doesn't matter. We've conceded ground. Dignitas Personae, which came out in 2008 after the PAL document, and it referenced Donum Vitae from 1987. It doesn't just talk about cooperation and evil. And Dr. Moschella did bring up scandal. In the early days of this discussion about cooperation and evil, there wasn't much discussion about scandal at all. And I'm glad that it's getting talked about more, because it is in the church documents. We're supposed to consider cooperation and evil and scandal. We're supposed to also consider what our choices say to our civilization. So it's not just like we go at this one slice in time. I'm going to consider whether I take the vaccine or not, and I'm done. It's not like we can't just do that. We have to think more critically, and we have to consider what our choice says to our society. And people are doing that. This is not a foreign concept. People get it. Again, Dignitas Personae, these all come from the same section 34 to 35, where it specifically talks about aborted fetal cell lines. The moral requirements must be safeguarded, that there be no complicity in deliberate abortion. So we obviously don't want to do that, and we're trying not to. And that the risk of scandal be avoided. They also mention scandal. The document also mentions scandal alongside cooperation in evil a third time in that section. So the point is, we can't just decide whether we're going to cooperate in evil. We can't just think about our decision in this point in time. We have to think about a bigger picture. Because, and I want to give you more of that bigger picture, vaccines started with fetal tissue research. The development of the polio vaccine, and these slides are going to be shared, so I put some links over here. I'm not going to get into it so much because we only have limited time. But these started with fetal tissue research. There were hysterotomies done, and that's like a C-section, but they take the baby out and kill it, or they kill it before they take it out. They were done on feeble-minded women who the government decided should not be having babies. And they admit in some of their research, they dissected them while they were still alive. I've done some research digging into infant formula. Nestle Corporation is tied to some development of infant formula. They were trying to figure out how to put the right amino acids in infant formula for preterm children. And they partnered with, in the Netherlands, researchers who found the women who had the babies far enough along. They gave anesthesia to the women, and they did a hysterotomy. They cut the babies out, and they held them in the room, still alive, with their hearts beating and legs kicking. The paper says that. And they injected amino acids into the umbilical cords and let the baby's body process it for 10 minutes before they killed them and cut the organs out to see how a preterm infant's body would process amino acids. The guy that did this research held a Nestle's Corporation conference a decade later, and he referred to this research when they were figuring out what to put in infant formula. So this is nothing new, benefiting from fetal tissue research. The consensus among ethicists in our nation today is that it's more moral, it's more ethical to use these bodies than waste them. You've seen already where the fetal cell lines come from, the human embryonic kidney. It's specimen 293. So Frank Graham and Van der Ebb, his advisor, the research scientist that Frank Graham worked for, did use human embryonic kidneys. 293 stands for the 293rd experiment. So it's not true that the fetal cell line just involved one aborted child. It's also very questionable, this talk about miscarriage now, as Father Austriaco has said, and here's why. Parents like me who've been dealing with this issue for decades have always been told it came from a healthy child that was aborted, because that's what Frank Van der Ebb, the advisor, Van der Ebb, the advisor of Frank Graham, said in the FDA hearings in 2001. He said the aborted child was healthy and it was an abortion. And so now that we get to COVID-19 in 2020, we have one priest saying, hey, I called the research assistant who did that research back in the 70s, and he says he can't remember if it was an abortion or a miscarriage. It sounds to us parents the church has operated on this being an abortion for all these years. The researchers themselves never corrected that. But now in 2020, when they want us to take the vaccine, they're saying, oh, it could have been a miscarriage. I mean, as a mother, that sounds like when my child changes the story when he realizes he's about to be in trouble. It just doesn't sit well with people who are wondering why, if it was a miscarriage, there's been controversy for 20 years. How come nobody ever said anything before? So I'm not saying whether it's true or not. I'm saying it was like, I don't know if that's true or not. It was weird. The other one did come from an abortion. Here's the other kind of research that's happening now, though. This is from September of last year. There was a paper from the University of Pittsburgh. They were proudly displaying the pictures of how they have taken aborted children in the second trimester and scalped them. They put them on the lab bench. They measured their feet so they would know the age of the fetus, the child. And then they took skin, full thickness skin down to the subcutaneous fat, They cut it off the head of the child and they grafted it onto the back of a baby mouse. Simultaneously, they took lymphoid tissues and liver tissues. They took internal organs and transplanted them into the baby mouse as well. So they grew a mouse that had the skin and the organs from the same human child. And they wanted to study staph infections. And this was funded by the government. It was funded by the NIH. And they took these pictures, and what you're looking at here is a baby hair growing from the scalp that was grafted onto the mouse's back. So I don't buy that when we say we're going to make an excuse and use HEK 293, I don't buy that we're not sending a message to the research culture in our nation that we're okay with benefiting from this research, because they're doing staph infections, they're studying staph infections, they're intending to bring us a benefit. In November, there was another research article about a fetal cell atlas, and this is a big deal. The Genome Project relied on fetal tissue research, and a lot of medical advance came from that. In this case, they're using single cell transcriptomics, which is a relatively new technique where they can analyze single cells, the entire nucleic acid sequence in the DNA of single cells or the RNA. And they're able to then say, how does a human develop from a zygote to a fully functioning body? But the way they're going to fill out this fetal cell atlas is that they're going to need lots of aborted children. And they lay them on the bench, dissect out the organs they want, pulverize the organs and get the DNA, get the cells out, analyze them. And you can see simply by the white space on this human cell atlas that they are only getting started. The reason they're doing this is because they hope to find cures for most pediatric deaths. So what we Catholics have to get our head around is there absolutely is medical knowledge and benefit that will come from fetal tissue research, just like with the vaccines. But where do we stop and say, I don't care, I'm not going to kill children to make my life longer? At what point do we as Catholics stand up and say, no more of this? Because we've just said we're okay with the vaccine. And I think we have a real problem going forward now. We have conceded our seat at that table where we have any legitimacy or authority to say, don't do this, because we've already told the whole world that we're okay with accepting the benefit from it. And there are absolutely benefits that come from it, as we've seen with HEK 293. So in the moral calculus, wrapping up, I'm not going to teach you quantum mechanics, that would fall to Tom. But to make a point about critical thinking and not taking the easy way out of this, I know it's a heartbreaking decision, but we really have to think about what we're doing right now. I've thought about this day and night, as I'm sure many of you have, and I really think there's a moment in history happening right now. And we need to not just say, I'm going to decide for myself whether to take the vaccine or not, and then I'm done. This is the Schrodinger equation for hydrogen. It took scientists a long time just to come up with Planck's constant, the significance of the charge of the electron and the proton, the Bohr radius, which is that last term over there, and the energy, the kinetic and potential energy in one atom, one hydrogen atom with one electron moving around. And scientists learned with quantum mechanics that you can't just pinpoint a particle in time. It's not that easy. Just like right now, we can't just pinpoint our single decision in time and be done with it. Life is much more complicated than that. The physical world is much more complicated than that. How much more so the moral calculus when we're talking about nations and globes of people with free will? It got real complicated real fast, again, as Tom can tell you better than I can. This next equation is when they said, what about when an atom has more than one electron? What about a multi-electron atom? And lots of things got involved there. And this is just a general equation for it. This is the generalized Laguerre polynomials are second order differentials for linear equations. It's just a way of solving them. These last things are the quantum numbers that we are familiar with as chemists on the periodic table. This right here is how we understand the periodic table. And it's an interaction of a bunch of change happening simultaneously. But it's what gives us the ability to make cell phones and all the other benefits that we have today. It's complicated, and we need to think about our decision with COVID-19 as more complicated, as a set of us in a moment in history making a decision in a changing environment. COVID-19 is causing things to change very fast. And we have to think very seriously about what our message is with our decision. Are we causing more abortions? Is our choice going to say to our nation, abortion's okay? We don't really need to make it illegal because we'll benefit from it. Are we dehumanizing humans by saying it's okay to kill these children and use them? I mean, we're not using slaves to build railroads anymore. 700,000 people gave their lives to end that injustice. Murder is illegal, so it's not the same. Abortion is still legal. So what does our message send to people? We do have to think about protecting ourselves, protecting our communities, gaining scientific and medical knowledge, but we also need to think about influencing sin in others if we're okay with the vaccines produced in fetal cell lines. We have to think about if we're benefiting from evil. We have to think about ethical concessions at the table when we're talking about fetal tissue research, and we have to think about our own salvation. So there are lots of questions. I think the biggest question is, how do we accept the vaccine if we get the jab without accepting the vaccine? Because that's the problem I've been struggling with as a parent for 20 years. And it doesn't work to say I accept and then say in a doctor's office I don't accept. There has to be a bigger outcry from the Catholic community. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Stacy. That was quite an interesting talk. That's the first time I've seen Schrodinger's equation in years. But anyway, we now move on to that part of the conference where we're going to look at your questions and answers. Again, it's down at the bottom. There's a Q&A tab there on your screen. Don't confuse it with the chat room. But if you haven't already turned in questions, you're still free to do so. I'm going to turn this over now to Sheila Roth at our ITEST headquarters in St. Louis, who's been monitoring the questions during both of these presentations. So this will be our question and answer session, and it'll run, we think, till just about noon. Go ahead, Sheila.
Thank you, Tom. Can you hear me okay?
Sure, yeah.
Okay, great. Here's our first question. Assuming that the vaccine does not prevent transmission, which we must currently assume, if there is in fact a safe alternative which reduces symptoms and which successfully treats COVID-19, for example, ivermectin with vitamin C, vitamin D, and zinc, why would we be morally permitted to use the vaccine?
Well, I think that's a good question, and it's part of the moral calculus. It fits into the part of the consideration where we say if there's no other alternative, because if there is some other alternative, we should not benefit from abortion.
I think there's a lot of conflicting research on, well, we simply don't know the extent to which vaccines prevent transmission. However, it's clear that in at least one way, vaccines do prevent transmission. So if you don't get sick, you're not going to transmit it to somebody else. So vaccination, at least indirectly, prevents transmission, just in the same way that vaccination ended, the smallpox epidemic and many other diseases, right? So it's clear that vaccination is the most direct way to achieve herd immunity, apart from basically having everybody get the disease, and not just get it once, but probably get it multiple times, because getting the disease, it seems, only confers immunity for maybe 6 months or so. So unless we want to be dealing with constant cycles of the most vulnerable people facing serious illness or being killed off from this, or want to continue indefinitely with quasi-lockdowns, vaccination is really the only way to go. Obviously, treatments can help, but treatments are still after the fact. And if it's only a treatment that we have, we're still going to find ourselves in positions where social and economic life is severely limited.
Okay, thank you. Here's another question. I'm a prayer advocate at our state's only abortion facility, and it grieves me to think that I would be one with abortion workers in being complicit in any phase of abortion. How can you appease this weight on my conscience? I appreciate Dr. Trasancos helping me understand the possible scandal I feel in this.
Oh, go ahead, Stacy.
No, well, this is a question that my husband and I get asked every day by people calling. It doesn't sit right to say it's okay to cooperate in evil. And the thing I find myself saying to them and is that God knows if you're struggling. I do believe that. God knows how much we struggled with the decision. And that's the thing that matters most, is that you are trying like everything to do the right thing. And if you feel like you're very much at risk and you need to get the vaccine, just use that passion to help both of us. I mean, Melissa's on the same page as me here. We want to do something about this situation in our culture. So if you do nothing else but pray, I mean, that's the best thing you can do.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. Certainly the power of that prayer and that witness at the abortion clinics is enormous. I do want to reiterate the point that I made in my presentation, though, that there are just light years of difference between what you might be doing by taking the vaccine and what the clinic worker at the abortion clinic is doing. The worker at the abortion clinic is formally cooperating with evil. The worker at the abortion clinic seeks to make abortions readily available to women. It's completely direct, and it's also immediate material cooperation. In other words, as close as you can get, right? She's helping the women get their abortions. Whereas taking the vaccine is not making any abortions happen. It's not helping any abortions to happen. At most, it is making it more likely that pharmaceutical companies will continue to use cell lines derived from aborted fetuses, which is already several steps from the abortion and already, at least in terms of intention, independent of the abortion. Again, people don't abort children for the sake of getting research material. The research material is then, they sort of take advantage of the fact that people make this decision to abort and use that material. Now, I'm not saying that that's okay, but I'm just pointing out how many steps removed we are from the actual evil of abortion.
All right, thank you. I have a question directed towards Dr. Moschella. It's regarding the concept of proportionate reason. You mentioned that there is perhaps a duty to be vaccinated to ensure the common good. My question relates to that definition of the common good, and with the vast number of unknowns that exist with these vaccines, especially the mRNA biologicals. My question relates to the concept of truly informed consent. For example, we now have evidence of a significant number, double digits, of stillbirths and miscarriages that are related in proximity to receiving the mRNA injection. Yet in the US, there continues to be a push to vaccinate pregnant women. This particular instance is a dramatic inconsistency with decades of caution regarding the vulnerable population of pregnant women observed since the Belmont Report. Can we rightly make the statement that the common good is best achieved by mass vaccination when there are so many unknowns regarding these entities?
So that's certainly a good question. Now, I'm not an expert on the efficacy of the vaccines. However, I have spoken to people who do know a lot more about the science of these vaccines and have looked even more deeply into studies about efficacy and about risks of the vaccines than I have. I have done some research into that. And so far, I have not seen any credible data connecting any of the vaccines to things like miscarriages or stillbirths. I'm not aware of the studies that the questioner is citing, so I can't speak to those, but it's important to remember that correlation is not the same thing as causation. And so, you know, we'd need to do some studies to see, is this a statistically unusual percentage of stillbirths and miscarriages in the vaccinated population? Or is this kind of within the norm of the percentage of stillbirths and miscarriages? Are there other things that might be contributing to these cases of stillbirths and miscarriage? We don't know that. I don't know enough to speak to that. But even if there's a connection between taking one of the mRNA vaccines and likelihood of miscarriage or stillbirth, which is questionable, but even if there is one, all that means is that we should not vaccinate pregnant women. That's a very, very small percentage of the population. So the larger question of the common good deals with risks to the broader population. And it seems to me that even though these vaccines were developed very quickly, the research on them and the trials done were quite rigorous. They were done with even more than the minimal number of people that's typically required for this. There's been huge public spotlight on any side effects or risks, and those things have been reported. I mean, so there's been, I think, great, despite the speed, I think there has been great care as far as is possible. There are always going to be potential risks, but we're weighing the I think very, very slight overall risks, unless you're the kind of person who's likely to have, you know, a reaction of anaphylactic shock or some extreme allergic response. But other than that, there's very, very slight risk that these vaccines posed, just like any other vaccination that we might get. And again, the benefit, not just for ourselves, but for the common good, is enormous. And I think this is important, is that vaccination, the decision to vaccinate isn't primarily a decision about protecting my own health. Certainly, that's important, and if somebody's at high risk, that increases the reason for vaccinating. But I think primarily it's about public health. It's about protecting those who are most vulnerable by making myself unlikely to be a carrier of the disease. And I do that by vaccinating myself.
Yeah. And I would add to that, just, you know, I'm thinking about it as we're talking. We're in Texas down here, and my kids go to public school, and they've been open since August. And my kids put their mask on, they go out, get on the bus, they go to school where there's 1,200 students plus all of the teachers and administration in one building together every day of the work week. And there are like 2 or 3 cases reported. I mean, they take social distancing precautions, and this, before the vaccines ever came out, it's been manageable. You know, if someone gets the test positive, they let people know, and the kids. So I know in some parts of the countries, the idea is that the vaccine is going to allow our kids to get back to school and our economy to get back going. In Texas, that's not how it happened. And so I do think that does factor into it. We are probably building, I mean, you can't know for sure, we're probably building herd immunity just by being together down here. And so we don't have a need to give pregnant women the vaccine. The vaccine is only going to the people, the older people and people with that are at risk.
All right, thank you. Next question. Is it fair to assume that the popularity of using fetal cells are due to stem cell potency or perhaps ease of access, or both? I didn't see the efficacy of use of adult stem cells in vaccine research, or even why the study at the University of Pittsburgh didn't choose to use adult stem cells rather than choose to abort fetal cells. What is the research out there using adult stem cells on COVID-19 vaccine?
Sanofi Pasteur has committed to, they just switched off of fetal cell lines in their rubella vaccine, and they now have an ethical one available because they were able to switch to adult cells. And they've got they've got 2 candidates. One of them is still being tested with the fetal cell lines, but the other candidate, in cooperation with GlaxoSmithKline, appears to be so far free of any abortion tainted, as far as we can tell. And, you know, to agree with what Melissa said, you can dig. At some point you run into everything's abortion tainted. But I know that one, Sanofi Pasteur, is trying. They have they understand that I think it affects their bottom line if they make a vaccine that people don't have conscientious objections to.
I think one thing to clarify is sometimes the waters get muddied in terms of talking about the use of fetal cell lines and the use of human embryos for research and embryonic stem cells for research. Again, I think it's really important to note the very, very important difference in kind between these uses. So when you're talking about research on embryonic stem cells, you're talking about research that involves both creating and destroying, often both creating and destroying, or at the very least destroying living human embryos for research, right? So the moral gravity of that is extremely direct. And again, it's a matter of you need more and more embryos to continue to do the research. When we're talking about research, or we're talking about vaccines, we're talking about cell lines that were derived from many years ago, originally from the tissue that came from one abortion, and that their use does not require ever new material, right? It doesn't require any more fetal tissue, doesn't require any more, doesn't require any embryos, right? So again, I think that difference is very, very important to note. And these cell lines, it's not just that they have, they certainly do have certain qualities, so that it's much easier to make a cell line from, say, fetal tissue because of the characteristics of the fetal tissue. There are also certain characteristics of that tissue that may just be useful for answering particular scientific questions, and that other tissue, even adult stem cell tissue, might not be able to answer. But again, I'll reiterate my point about the fact that the very commonality or ubiquity of a cell line like HE293 is part of what makes it a popular choice for scientists. You want to use research material that you know, that the properties of which are well known in the scientific community. And so that's why the value of these already existing cell lines is actually very high for researchers, independent of the kind of specific properties of the cells that were used to derive them. And the last thing I'll say here, again, which is important to note, is that there's nothing intrinsically evil about using fetal tissue in research. The problem is that fetal tissue came from abortions, and that, as Stacy rightly said, unlike murder or unlike other situations where we might say, use an organ from a murder victim, with proper consent, and we would agree that that's ethically fine. That abortion is different because abortion is legal, right? And so, that's part of the problem with this. But if abortion were not legal, and there were proper consent, ways to get proper consent from somebody who wasn't complicit in the abortion, it might not be wrong to use aborted fetal tissue in research. It certainly wouldn't be wrong to use fetal tissue from a spontaneous miscarriage with proper consent in research. So it's not that all use of fetal tissue in research is bad. It's only bad when it is being derived from abortion in the context in which abortion is considered to be not just morally okay, but even a right by some people, and in the context where you're not able to get proper consent.
Yeah, and just where this conversation is going among Catholics in the nation now, I have already heard Catholics say, maybe it's not unethical to use aborted children in research. And that makes me very disappointed because I hope things don't go in that direction. Because that's all.
Okay, that relates to our next question that's directed to Melissa. And he says, while your discussion of scandal may hold true in an academic setting like this, I doubt seriously the average Catholic or average American will understand the distinction. Don't you think scandal will realistically still occur?
I don't think so. I think there are fairly simple ways to explain the fact that what's going on here is very far removed from the original evil. I mean, in similar ways to the explanation in the USCCB document, which I think is very clear about how far removed this is from the original evil in question, and also helping people to realize that, as I said before, cooperation with evil or appropriation of the benefits of evil is extremely common in our everyday life. So if we're buying Energizer batteries and we're baking with Chase and we have our retirement funds in TIAA or Vanguard, we are cooperating with abortion more directly than we would be by taking the vaccine. And I think helping people to understand this is not a matter of being soft on abortion or failing to recognize the gravity of it. It's just a matter of saying we live in a really morally complex world where, unfortunately, it's literally impossible to remain sort of pure, isolated from evils that are going on all around us. Even if we go off to some, monastery or hermitage, even so, right? Some of the products that you're going to be using are going to have some moral taint to them. So I think the point is that living in the world and fulfilling our obligations, right? So it's not that questions about the permissibility of cooperating with evil or appropriating evil, or even questions about, well, gosh, it would be better if you could somehow remove yourself and isolate yourself from everything and be freed from all taint, right? That actually could require then removing yourself from the possibility of engaging in the world so as to bring about the kingdom of God, so as to transform it, so as to change these immoral structures and make them better, right? So we need to be in the midst of this, which is going to mean involving some cooperation with evil or appropriation with evil, precisely so that we can evangelize the world, so that we can fight for better policies to, for instance, stop any funding that uses new fetal tissue or new embryonic cells in research. The Trump administration had a directive of that sort that ended all federal funding for new use of fetal tissue. Unfortunately, the current administration will obviously rescind that if they haven't already. But those are the sorts of policies we should work for, as well as policies directly to end abortions, to address the underlying causes of abortions, to provide women with real alternatives to abortions by being there to support them, as so many of our wonderful pregnancy, crisis pregnancy centers and so on already do. Right, that I think is where we should be directing our energies, and that's going to involve being in a messy world where you will be involved in chains of causality that have some connection to evils, but that's unavoidable.
I don't find that is satisfactory to people who are struggling with it, because the people that are struggling with receiving a vaccine that was produced or tested in an aborted fetal cell line, it's not the same to them as paying taxes. Because when you pay your taxes, you give unto Caesar, and it goes off, and you don't have a choice. It is very intensely personal to people to know that they are taking an injection of something that depended on an aborted child. It is heartbreaking to people. And the more these arguments are made, that we're sitting here talking about it, discussing it, I'm finding that when I talk to people, and I'm sure pastors do this way more than I do, just at Children of God for Life, people aren't satisfied with that. They still want to, it sounds like making an excuse. And they still want to know what they can do. And I honestly don't see how we can affect legislation to defund fetal tissue research now. Okay, because with the Trump administration, what happened is there was a committee that was going to review. That committee only ended up meeting one time, and they reviewed 15 fetal tissue reports, and they rejected 14 of them. And that was good. It was a step in the right direction. But meanwhile, this fetal cell atlas thing came along. There's a ability in genetics now to analyze the human development, and that is a holy grail of scientific research, to understand how a zygote goes to differentiated cells that form organs that coordinate into a body. And they have a way to study that now. So I don't know how we as Catholics come to the table and say, we want legislation that defunds fetal tissue research, because it's predicted to reduce pediatric deaths largely, to understand how diseases get started in an unborn child. And we've already said we're okay with benefiting from it. So I really don't know why anybody at the legislative level would listen to us if we're saying that we're okay with fetal tissue research, or that we might be okay with it, or that we're okay with benefiting from the vaccine. I think we have to think a lot harder about that. And I think these people that call and they're reacting and they're in tears about it, I think they're on the right track. We need to do something. We can't just talk it away. We've got to do something.
I think part of what we can do, obviously, is continue to work for, we do have a Supreme Court, which is well poised to potentially overturn directly or indirectly Roe versus Wade, return the issue to the states, and allow for much more significant restriction on abortion, at least in more conservative states. But I think what we need to do is just go directly at the issue of abortion. What we can also do is say, look, there are alternatives. There are ways to get fetal tissue for research that are not from aborted fetuses. It's possible, if we simply developed the coordination with hospitals and so on, to get fetal tissue from spontaneous miscarriages or non-viable preterm births. And if we came up with a counter proposal like that, particularly in the context of hopefully lessening supply, of aborted fetuses, as perhaps abortion legislation makes abortion less common, we could slowly turn the tide here. This is not going to be an overnight thing, obviously, right? But the way our political landscape works is, when the administration's not in your favor, you retreat, you change tactics, but you wait also for the next favorable moment.
Okay, we have another question. It's a little bit long, but it's something that I think some of us share this person's thoughts. To what degree does an individual's situation in life impact the morality of one's decision to take the vaccine? Case in point, I'm a healthy 52-year-old who hasn't seen my 78-year-old vulnerable parents in 14 months. I feel morally obligated to, quote, get the jab in order to see my parents, who may or may not have many years left to live. Yet I remain conflicted about this choice because of the remote cooperation with evil and the possibility of promoting a market for aborted tissue. I understand I may have a proportionate reason to take the vaccine, but I still feel uncomfortable. If I had a direct way to advocate or lobby the vaccine industry effectively, that might assuage my conscience. Can you provide ways for us to lobby them effectively? For example, email templates and lists of vaccine manufacturers. Contact emails would be helpful.
We're working on that at Children of God for Life. My husband and I literally blew up what we're doing. I backed away from my job with Bishop Strickland to part-time, and he came out of retirement, and we sort of jumped off that cliff together holding hands to take on this new issue of Children of God for Life, inherited it from Debbie Vintage. And he's got a PhD in applied mathematics. He's Army Special Forces retired, and I have a scientific background. So he is working on it right now, a way to coordinate people to email. So it's not just onesies and twosies emailing legislators or emailing the pharmaceutical industry, but getting all these people who are just like the one who asked the question. She's the same age as me. I got parents. I am exactly in the same situation as you are, by the way. To coordinate where large numbers all in one day email these people, because then they can't ignore it. And we talked to legislators already. And when I told one legislator about fetal tissue research happening now, when I impressed upon him the significance of what's happening, this wave of fetal tissue research coming our way, it was a wake-up call. He didn't know about it. So we're trying to educate people about what's actually happening today. We're trying to find a way for people to coordinate our efforts together. And whether you say you should get the vaccine or whether you say you shouldn't, we can all unite on how to get forward. And then I know Melissa and I are very much on the same page with that. And that we are working on it. We spend day and night trying to get this stuff going. We just started at Children of God for Life January 1st. So.
Yeah, I want to add, reiterate that Stacy and I are clearly on the same side here and on the same page about all these efforts to, prevent the ongoing use of aborted fetal tissue in research. But then, to add about the specific situation is, I think it's a great example of the fact that, again, we need to realize how, again, without taking away the gravity of the evils here, is that we shouldn't think that, trying to remain untainted by this is the best way to go forward in the face of conflicting duties, right? And the duties that we might have to, say, our elderly parents are very serious ones, very grave ones. And so I think that needs to be taken very, very seriously as well. And that needs to be weighed against, I think, what is at most the extremely minimal and extremely remote connection to abortion that taking the vaccine has, and that you can counteract that in many ways. Obviously, a direct complaint to pharmaceutical companies of the sort that Stacy and her husband are, wonderfully working so hard to engineer is great. But you can also counteract that by just working against abortion, praying for an end to abortion more generally, right? I mean, that's the broader concern, the broader evil that we're all trying to end in various ways.
Okay. What is the church doing to educate Catholics? I'm involved in the pro-life movement, so I try to search for information, but a very, very large majority of Catholics aren't even aware that this is an issue and do not even know that the bishops made a statement. Many probably heard that the Pope strongly recommends all Catholics to receive the vaccine. If Catholics are unaware and take the vaccine and do not voice their objections, do the church leaders hold a moral responsibility for that?
The answer to that is no. Just like if we, buy a product that is made with slave labor and directly contributes to that ongoing, extremely unjust regime of, kidnapping children, forcing them into slave labor, putting them into terrible conditions. We don't know about it. Maybe we should know about these things, but you can't know about the origin of every product that you use, right? So while there is a moral obligation to inform your conscience, it's simply impossible to know where everything comes from. And if you don't know about it, then, given, again, how remote you are from the evil, there simply is no possibility that you could be formally cooperating with evil or approving of the prior evil, because you're not even aware of it, as is the case with most of the cooperation in evil or appropriation of the fruits of evil that goes on in our day-to-day lives.
I would say that bishops do have a moral obligation to inform the people, because what I saw happen with the mRNA vaccines, Moderna and Pfizer, that came out, there literally was a word that was made up called confirmatory testing. That word is not a word that's used in vaccine development. Sorry, there's an ambulance going by. And people, and I saw bishop letter after bishop letter. I saw priests, and people call us now saying, my priest told me this, that don't worry about the Moderna or Pfizer vaccine. It was a confirmatory test done one time. There is absolutely no scientific evidence for that. What happens in research and development and production, which I do have experience in with DuPont, whatever lab test you do, you also do in quality control testing in an ongoing way. And so if you know that the product works on the lab bench like this, when you scale it up, think of taking one recipe for chocolate chip cookies and then changing it to feed 400. There are issues involved in the scale up. And so you absolutely have to do the same test from the lab in the production facility so that you're making the thing the right way. And what we don't know, because the FDA hasn't released those manufacturing details yet, we don't know if they're going to do the confirmatory testing, which was an in vitro test where they put the vaccine in the cells to see if it would produce the spike protein like it's supposed to. We don't know yet if they're going to do that in an ongoing production type of way. And I mean, ultimately, it doesn't really matter. They're still using the fetal cell line. But so many people have called us and said, my priest said, don't worry about it. It was a confirmatory test done one time. And that is misinformation. So I think there is a moral obligation for the leaders to give people good information and to ask questions if something doesn't make sense and not just believe what they're told without a critical assessment. I mean, we have a right to say, where's the evidence for that? I need to base my decision, because it matters to people whether a fetal cell line is used in an ongoing way during production or whether it was used one time. It's different. So I hope, I mean, we're all in this together. And a lot of people didn't know about it. I didn't know about it till I had babies and was trying to do the right thing about vaccinations with them. And so we're having conferences like this. We're talking about it. We're all doing our part. More and more people are awake to this issue now and talking about it. And I really hope that it goes, you might not know this, but I am so sick of talking about vaccines. Like, I'm so sick of talking about vaccines, because in my mind, talking about vaccines, even if we did, and Melissa and I think agree here, even if all the pharmaceutical companies stopped using fetal cell lines, we still have a problem with fetal tissue research. And so if we're focusing on fetal cell lines and vaccines, it's kind of like dumping water out of the boat with a bucket, but the boat's got a hole in it and we're not dealing with the hole. So, there's a lot of education that needs to go on about this. And I think it's good that the conversation is progressing now.
Okay, next question. Is it true that the Pontifical Academy for Life does not possess magisterial teaching authority, while the CDF does, and that CDF has definitively stated that, quote, it is morally acceptable to receive COVID-19 vaccines that have used cell lines from aborted fetuses in the research and production process, end quote?
Well, I think all of these documents have relatively low levels of magisterial authority. The Pontifical Academy for Life is even lower in levels of authority by comparison with the statement from the CDF. But a note from the CDF is quite low level of authority. It's not an encyclical. It's not, the unanimous opinion of the bishops gathered in council united with the Pope, or even, over time. It's clearly not definitive, clearly not infallible, any of these statements, right? They are trying to work out the moral calculus basically in much the same way that we are here. And obviously there's a certain weight to their statements and pronouncements. I think it's part of why the CDF statement is brief and pretty general. It's basically just repeating the considerations in Dignitas Personae, also a document of the CDF with a relatively low level of authority. All of these things require serious attention and a sort of default agreement, but again, they're not infallible teachings, and sometimes on the very specifics, application of principles to specific cases, they could be mistaken.
And and it's important to remember they're giving us guidance. I mean, this is one of those. Another thing I found myself saying, it's kind of like when somebody says, how many children does the church say I should have? The church does not say that. And no priest, no bishop is going to ever tell you that. That is something you have to decide for yourself. Who should I marry? Church isn't going to tell you that either. This is a decision like that. The church is providing us guidance, and we are to take this guidance into consideration. But it's an application of doctrine in a moment in time that's never happened before. So we are literally all working this out together. And the best thing we can do right now is each of us prudentially judge in prayer what we need to do. If you need to take the vaccine so you can go see your parents, I totally get that, and nobody's going to tell you whether you should or shouldn't. You have to decide for yourself. And that, so that CDF document, the Pontifical Academy for Life, it's guidance, I think is the good way to put it.
Okay, thank you. Next question. Since the origin of HEK 293 is unknown, otherwise known as illicit, why not suspend its use entirely? In moral choices, Aquinas cautions that in the presence of doubt, one should suspend action. Can't we as a human race pave another path with more moral purity and discard these morally compromised cell lines? Justifying their widespread use could be ethical concession.
Well, I think when Thomas Aquinas talks about when in doubt, go for the safe choice, he's talking about things like, if you're hunting and you're not sure about what's rustling in the bushes, whether it's a deer or your hunting partner, you don't shoot, right? He's talking about things like that. We're not quite dealing with that when we talk about things like HEK 293. It's not a matter of doubt. I mean, there is some doubt. Again, it seems that the preponderance of evidence favors the claim that the cell line was originally derived from the tissue of a fetus that was aborted electively, right? Not a spontaneous miscarriage. So I think we can presume that the origins of that cell line are immoral. But there's a further question of, is it wrong now to benefit from that prior immorality? And it's a similar sort of question that confronts us when we think about, do we use the knowledge obtained from the Nazi anatomy experiments to teach our medical students anatomy? Do we, use the knowledge and experiments that the Nazis did to develop the drug chloroquine, or do we have to redo those experiments? I think we ask a similar question about HEK 293, given that using it in itself doesn't require any new abortions, any new fetal tissue, and that using it has significant benefits because of the store of scientific knowledge that we now have about it in terms of how it behaves, in terms of the ability to compare the research of different scientists because they all use the same materials and so on, that there's much good that's now possible because of the existence of that cell line. We have to make a decision. Well, does that mean that we can use it in research, given its important benefits, despite the fact that we're appropriating the fruit of evil here, just as we are with medical research from Nazi experimentation and other things.
And I like to make the analogy that, if you move that forward, that's why I use that fetal cell atlas to put in front of people, because I do think it's connected to the vaccine discussion. I said I'm tired of talking about vaccines because I think the bigger discussion is about fetal tissue research. And I'm concerned that our acceptance of the vaccine sends a message that we're willing to benefit from fetal tissue research, because that's what we're doing. The fetal cell atlas, understanding the development trajectory at a genetic level, at a molecular level, is huge. And it will bring about benefits. It absolutely will bring about understanding to cure diseases in children and prevent death. So we're kind of like in the Nazi Germany stage right now. This research is happening now. They are, I hate to put it this way, but it's the truth. They are butchering babies on the lab bench to do this research. And I've talked to people that worked at the University of Pittsburgh, one woman who left and was in the tissue bank. They do coordinate with the abortionists and say, we need some samples in this age range. And they do work together to get fresh samples. And that's happening right now. So it's like the Nazi thing is happening right now. They are experimenting with these babies now. And if we don't do anything about it right now, we're kind of like that story where people were singing louder in the church so they wouldn't hear the screams. We're in that situation because the day is going to come down the road. And when that day comes down the road and we're having a discussion, well, should we be accepting the benefit from these aborted children that were killed back in 2021? We have a responsibility. We can't just wait 10 years and say, no, we shouldn't, but we aren't responsible for that because we know it's happening now and we're not doing anything about it. So just to move it forward, it's not going to be okay. I mean, we will have not met our obligation if we wait 10 years and say, oh, this research from aborted children, well, that was wrong, but it's okay to save my child now. Because we need to be willing to say right now, that research is wrong, even if it brings cures. That research is wrong. We don't kill the unwanted children and exploit them like lab rats to save the wanted children. That's happening now.
Though again, I should note that the abortions are not happening for the sake of the research, which also makes it a big difference from some of these analogous cases.
Yeah, they do tell the women, and you're right, and that I have heard stories where they tell the women who are considering abortion, it's okay, you know, look, if you're considering the abortion, here's one good thing. If you do have this abortion, your child can be donated to science and something good will come of it. So they are using it to put pressure on women. And those are anecdotal stories because nobody goes out and does a scientific study of that. But I've heard plenty of reports of that happening from women who were in that situation.
Okay, here's the next one. There are significant questions regarding the potential of pathogenic priming in future immunologic adverse reactions from the mRNA biologicals from credible sources, as well as questions about the efficacy and data that was excluded from the published efficacy testing. Among those I'm referencing here are the concerns of Dr. Peter Dashi, the associate ed of the prestigious BMJ. If in fact there are long-term side effects from the mRNA vaccines, the common good would be harmed. Public distrust in the process and vaccines would be further harmed. How do these concerns weigh into the moral calculations as we go forward? Considering that there are other ethical vaccines in process following the prescribed route of animal testing and strict phase 1 and phase 2 trials, would it not be more prudent to wait for these vaccines rather than to accept new and experimental technology that is also tainted with abortion?
It might be for you. I mean, that's kind of like I'm waiting. And I said already, we vaccinated our children with vaccines grown in fetal cell lines 15 years ago, knowingly, because we made that moral calculus and figured we'd do it. But I'm waiting on the vaccine right now just because I live in a place where people can spread out. It's Texas. There's not an urgency here. So it all of that, and I'm not going to speak to the medical stuff because I'm not qualified to. That's why I avoid that. Talk to your doctor about that. It might be the case for you to wait. I'm waiting.
Yeah, likewise, I can't really speak to the medical stuff. Again, the people that I have spoken to that are more knowledgeable about this have said that there is a little bit of scaremongering out there, and some, just because somebody has credentials, it doesn't mean that the things that they say about the vaccine side effects or, conspiracy theories about cover-ups are actually credible. So, like I said, I haven't looked into the specific claims that the questioner brings up, so I can't assess those, but I would just encourage, again, sort of thinking critically about those and really digging deeper to see if the information is in fact credible and published in, peer-reviewed journals with credibility in the broader scientific community.
Okay, here's another question. In Dr. Moschella's presentation, you used the argument that many actions include some evil or injustice and somehow excuses for the use of these aborted fetal cell lines. This is moral relativism. It is important to qualify that certain actions are more or less evil. For instance, how can you equate the injustice of slavery with the intrinsic evil of abortion? The gravity of the issue is such that we have an obligation to remove all evils from our life and from society. However, the evil of abortion must be rejected in all its forms, including benefiting from it. So are you not using moral relativism arguments to excuse evil?
So that's a great question. Let me just say for the record, I am absolutely not a moral relativist. I begin all of my undergraduate ethics classes with a class refuting moral relativism, explaining why it's completely inconsistent and wrong. And well, there's really nobody who's actually a consistent moral relativist. If you cut in line in the store or ahead of them, they're no longer going to be a moral relativist, regardless of what they say. They're going to say that what you did was wrong. Or you take their iPhone, they'll say the same thing. Anyway, but none of the arguments that I'm presenting here are relativist arguments, just like the arguments that the church presents in the Pontifical Academy for Life statements, or in Dignitas Personae, or in the CDF statement, or the USCCB statement on the vaccines, talking about cooperation in evil. None of these are relativist statements. What we're recognizing here is that we live in a fallen world in which some people's actions, well, all of us, of course, are sinners, right? But in which there are unjust actions, that there are grave evils that are going on all around us, and in which we cannot avoid being affected by and sometimes benefiting from the grave evils that other people commit. So none of this is denying that there are grave evils of abortion, of slavery in the past or in the present in some parts of the world, unfortunately, and other things. None of this is saying that it's okay to promote those grave evils. It's certainly never okay to approve of those grave evils or to formally cooperate in those grave evils, right? To assist in those grave evils with the actual intention of promoting the evil. But my point was simply that life necessarily involves either benefiting from the evils that other people engage in, or indirectly cooperating with, contributing to ongoing evils that are occurring in our society. You simply cannot live in an organized society, pay taxes, drive on the roads, shop at any normal store without involving yourself in concatenations of evil, many of which are quite serious. The coffee that was made with forced labor from children sold into slavery by their parents, who are whipped and beaten when they do not fulfill their production quotas, or if they try to run away and they're caught or kept in horrific conditions, right? That's a terrible injustice. It's not clear to me that abortion is worse than that. I mean, it doesn't matter if it's better or worse. They're both horrific injustices. And so what I'm saying is simply that, living in the world means that we can't escape, even if we would like to, benefiting from these injustices. But we certainly have an opportunity, have a grave obligation to try to bring those injustices to an end. But we can't retreat and isolate ourselves from society, or try to be free of the taint of these injustices, because that's not possible.
Yeah, it feels like to me, so I'm going to say something kind of personal here, but this is how it feels. So I'm a chemist, and I have to work at saying it feels, because I don't always do that very well. But it's like as a mother, our 15-year-old daughter called me a few years ago and said, "Mom, I'm pregnant." Okay. And she's been raised chastity, virtue, religious education. I taught it, in Catholic school. She's been raised to know the difference and know the value of family. She's been raised in a family, but she got pregnant, and the baby will be 1 year old next week. My daughter ended up graduating from high school a year early because when COVID-19 hit last year, she had a newborn, and she said, "Give me all the online classes for my junior and my senior year." And she finished them, and she walked the stage a year early because people told her, "With a baby, you'll never graduate." So she got stronger because of it. But here's the point. This feels the same kind of way, because my husband and I are looking at each other going, how do we not cooperate in the sin? How do we tell our other kid? How do we love this daughter, which we did? We told her, "You love that baby unconditionally." That's the first thing I said to her. "You love that baby unconditionally, and just like we love you unconditionally, and let that guide everything you do from here on out." And she did. It's been hard. But we had this situation where, on one hand, we're supporting what this daughter did, the sex outside of marriage, and we're telling our other kids, "Don't you do that." And so we did have a situation where it felt like we were accepting without accepting. And all I can say is there are no easy answers. And I think that's what we have to get our head around right now. We are. That's why you all are here. We're trying to get our head around this, but it is a complicated situation. How do we accept the vaccine without accepting the benefit. I mean, how do you accept without accepting? How do you individually accept in your moment, like I did with my daughter, at the same time teach the rest of the society, just like I taught my other kids, don't do that? Well, they saw the struggles she had. They learned from it. They also saw that we're going to love them no matter what. They saw the pain it put everybody through. And maybe there's a moment like that right now in our country. You know, people are scared to death of this vaccine, rightfully so. People are struggling with the conscience of what to do about taking these vaccines. And maybe it's a moment for us Catholics to be, you know, the Holy Mother Church, us Catholics to be the grown-ups in the room who help our whole nation get through this. So I'm glad I mean, I always said in our family, every family has problems. The family that appears perfect is just not talking about their problems. And so you have to talk about your problems. And that is what we're doing. We're talking about the problems and we're trying to figure out. That's the only way we're going to figure out what to do, because we've never been in a situation like this before.
Okay, thank you very much, Stacy and Melissa. These have both been wonderful presentations and wonderful answers to questions. But unfortunately, it is kind of time to wrap up this webinar. I want to remind everyone, when you registered for this webinar, you went to our ITEST website, which is www.faithscience.org. And that's where you filled out the form to get into this particular webinar. We want to invite you to check out more features of that website, including past webinars, publications, everything else we've done for 50 years, as well as how to join ITEST as a regular member. So again, it's www.faithscience, all run together, .org. Anyway, I want to thank all of you for attending, and I hope this event has been a very valuable experience for you. I'd now like to call on Sister Marianne Postiglione to conclude with our closing prayer.
Thank you, Tom. Let's take a few seconds just to remember that Christ is with us here. O most holy Trinity, we thank you, giver of gifts freely given. We come before you as listeners, believers, and searchers. We've been enlightened by the words and wisdom of Stacy and Melissa. Help us to keep that light burning in our minds and hearts. We have been enriched by our participation. Help us to increase those riches in our lives for the benefit of those we encounter. With this knowledge and richness, we have been empowered to seek the truth. Help us to use these great gifts of enlightenment, enrichment, and empowerment with conviction, tempered by gentleness, toward those with whom we work and live in your name. O cloud of witnesses, all ITEST members who have died and entered eternal life, we ask you to intercede for all of us with God, asking God to pour his special blessing on all those scientists, theologians in the faith ministry, and others, teachers, researchers, those working in the field of medical research, to extend your blessing on them always. In the names of Jesus and Mary, who together are Lord and Lady over all creation, forever and ever, amen.
Again, thanks to everyone, and this is the conclusion of today's webinar. Thank you for coming.
Thank you.